So everybody, this is the window you have to pin. Please pin it now.
Good afternoon to you all, and welcome to this EU GreenWeek session 4.3 on counting down to a cleaner future, monitoring the risks of hazardous chemicals. Thank you for tuning in from wherever you are to follow the discussions in this session, which is organised in collaboration with the European Environment Agency and the European Commission's Joint Research Centre. I'm Aminda Lee. I'm a British-Italian journalist and moderator specialising in environmental topics, and I'm logged in from Rome, where today Italy is celebrating its 75th anniversary as a republic, though the weather is a bit downcast and overcast. I'm delighted to guide the discussions in this session, but before we start, I have a few practical reminders for you. First of all, questions can be sent in via Slido. There's a QR code on the auditorium screen that you're watching on, or you can go to Slido and put in EU GreenWeek 2021. The details are in your virtual auditorium. And we are session number 4.3, so please choose us. Once the questions appear after being moderated, you can vote on them, and I'll be trying to go to the ones that have the highest votes first. And of course, why not spread the news on Twitter and use the hashtag EU GreenWeek? Now, I'd like to actually start off with a quick Slido poll to find out what you know and think about monitoring. And the poll question is, if we could please launch the poll, the EU efforts of monitoring chemicals in the environment are, and then you have some options, and the options are not enough, enough, too much, and I don't know. So if you would like to start filling in your answers to that, and in the meantime, I will start to tell you how the session is going to work. We're going to start with 3 very short presentations, followed by a panel debate with other speakers. This first section will look at why monitoring is so important in preventing and mitigating chemical pollution in our rivers, soils, and of course air. And then we'll also see why making the data accessible is crucial and how the data is collected and shared. And we'll be finding out about the Information Platform for Chemical Monitoring, or Ipchem. Let me introduce our speakers for the first part of this session. When I say your names, please say hello. So we have Caroline Wally, who is water industries and pollution expert at the European Environment Agency.
Hello, everybody.
We have Marco Falconi, who is water and land expert team leader at the European Union Network for the Implementation and Enforcement of Environmental Law.
Hello, everybody. Good afternoon.
And we have Stephanie Bopp, who is Project Officer in Scientific Research at the Joint Research Centre, the JRC.
Good afternoon.
So before we hear from them, I'd like to close the Slido poll and see what you think about the EU's efforts in monitoring chemicals in the environment. Can we see the results, please? Okay, well, so not enough, 77%. And very few people think enough. Some people don't know, okay, but hardly anyone thinks too much, only 5%. So we're not doing enough. That's what the audience thinks. Thank you very much for that. I think now is probably a good moment to go to our first speaker, Caroline Wally from the EEA, to react to those poll results and tell us exactly what Europe is doing. The virtual floor is yours. I can't hear you. I think you maybe need to.
Sorry, thank you. Thanks very much. Those poll results are quite interesting. We're going to talk to you today a bit about what monitoring is going on and what can be done in the future. So why do we do monitoring? We do it to gather information on the environment. We use this information to find out if there's harmful substances present. because we need to prevent those getting into our air, water and soils. Chemical monitoring is broad. It ranges from things like acidity and nutrients to more harmful things like pesticides and metals and maybe pharmaceuticals. But we also do it to look for emerging pollutants, things that might be a problem in future. Could I have the slides, please? In the EU, the water monitoring has got a very long history, actually, with the 1975 directive on drinking water standards. Why have we got this? Because water is a transboundary issue. If countries upstream pollute water, maybe those downstream that need to use that for drinking water, that gives them more of a problem. So there's a real incentive in the EU to have a common approach to water, and the monitoring that helps that. So I'm just waiting for the next slide. It doesn't want to play. Okay, here we go. So who's doing this monitoring? Well, often it's a regulator in the country. They'll be monitoring the waters, for example, for drinking water safety or bathing water safety. But sometimes it's the polluter, it's the industry that's going to go out and report. And here we've got an example of industries reporting on metals and other contaminants under the European Pollutant Release and Transfer Register. But we've also in Europe, we really rely on source control. Okay, we try and prevent harm happening. We try and prevent pollutants getting out, and we use things like the REACH regulation or pesticides regulations to prevent harm. But we need to find out if that's working. We have to go out and monitor and find out if the pollutants are in the environment. Sorry, my phone keeps stopping here. Next slide. So we're going to look a bit about nutrients here. So nutrients like nitrates and phosphates, if there's too many of those in the water, we get eutrophication, which is when we get excessive algal growth and lots of algae grow out, and when that dies, it takes out the oxygen, and it really gives us dead rivers. Okay, so when we started off, we had rather little information at European level. Here we've got information for about 6 countries, for about 6 or 7 rivers, and that's over 20 years. That's not very much an European overview. But this information, we've been getting better at getting it and better at presenting it. So here in the mid-90s at the EEA, we started being able to plot some dots on a map. Sorry, they're not very clear, but we've got little dots on a map that we can get together over a few years. And then most recently, we've been able to produce, with the help of countries reporting data to us, we can do quite detailed maps with concentrations of phosphate and what level of degree whether that's a problem or not. So our ability to gather data and then present it is getting better and better. So I'm just trying to change slide. Okay, what are we going to do with all this information? We've collected all this information about nutrients. How do we use it? Well, we can use it to monitor the impact of policies. So here, if we stay with nutrients, we've got phosphate, and this is phosphate in rivers. I'm sorry if it's a bit faint here, but what we can see is from the 1991, from the early 1990s, phosphate concentrations in rivers really dropped quite a lot. Okay, so this is in European rivers, and we attribute this to the Urban Wastewater Treatment Directive, where improved sewage treatment has led to reduced phosphate. But at the same time, we had a nitrates directive, and that was really directed at same sort of addressing the eutrophication. But unfortunately, we haven't had the same impact on the nitrate concentrations in rivers. And we can sort of say that this is actually maybe the nitrates coming from agriculture, and that policy hasn't worked so well. And then this information, the information we're now gathering at a European level is getting more and more and wider and better. But we've got our ability to present this and how we make sure it's accessible needs to increase. So in 2018, we published a paper report, if you like, which showed the status of water, chemical status of waters in Europe. And it's 180 water bodies. Red is bad and blue is okay. But a year later, we were able to present the map viewer. Okay, so this is the water body status of individual water bodies reported by the EU, reported by countries to the EU, and we can make it available. This has been almost an exponential increase in data availability and our ability to present the information. But this is just for a few chemicals here. We have information for thousands of chemicals. And Stephanie's going to talk more about how we do more of this in her talk. First, we go to Marco, who's going to talk about soils, where the information availability is rather less. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting that actually monitoring chemicals can also help us monitor policies. I think we may talk a little bit more about that later on. Thank you. And so now we, after hearing about water, we're now going to go to soil, as we've heard. And to tell us more, I'm going to hand over to Marco Falconi, an expert in land and contaminated sites, who also works for the Italian Institute for Environmental Protection and Research. And he's going to tell us why contaminated sites are so important in monitoring. Over to you, Marco Falconi.
Thank you, Aminda. Let's start with the name of this session, Counting Down to a Cleaner Future, Monitoring the Risk of Hazardous Chemicals. So why contaminated sites can be useful in monitoring? For three main reasons. They are a source of pollution, very often not controlled. They generally have a cocktail of chemicals and other dangerous material not ever identified. And in some cases, there is no liable company because they bankrupt. This is an example. For instance, in Loznica, is in Serbian Republic, you can see the situation very unbelievable. No, we have carbon disulfide, black liquor. It's a material used for the production of viscose, furfural, that is a solvent, and waste fuel oils. Asbestos, you can see those above ground storage tank with asbestos there. No, you see from the picture. And how many sites we have of this type in Europe? It's something that is also difficult difficult to answer. The Joint Research Center, together with AUNET Group in Europe, has estimated a number of 2.8 million of sites where polluting activities took or are taking place. The situation in Europe is not easy to be described because we don't have common definitions. For instance, what is a potentially contaminated site? What is a contaminated site? What is a remediated site? Even a remediated site has a different meaning in different member states. So it was an effort from JRC and the EA to understand, to find common definition. You see the pictures, the global pictures in Europe in 2018. 2.8 million, so we have already said, 360,000 sites need of investigation, 122,000 investigated sites, but no remediation needed. Sometimes we don't have the problem. 148,000 sites that need or might need remediation, 14,000 sites with remediation ongoing, and 63,000 sites remediated. As you can see, we cannot make a good mapping of chemical risk without considering data from contaminated sites. You see the huge amount of contaminated sites we have in Europe. And with this graph, you see the site status number 2, the sites in need of or under investigation, but more than seeing that Austria and Belgium has more sites in need of investigation than Italy or France, we have to concentrate on another thing. Is the information at country level informative? Would you better to know the situation in your municipality, in your region, better than the situation in country level? It's something that is worth to be explored, knowing that the Inspire Directive environmental data paid by taxpayers should be public. We should also stimulate the member states to collect more info and the better communication of what are the situation about contaminated sites, for instance. How data should look like? See this map. This is a map from US EPA that you are able to find your nearest Superfund sites are the most polluted areas in America. You are able to see where is the waste management plant or whatever. So the question is how you would prefer environmental data looks like. A 1,000 pages PDF, or you prefer an interactive map like this? I think that you don't ask me the question. Don't ask me the question because you know my opinion already. Going to the successful story, it's not just a bad story. You see that contaminated sites grab the attention of the most important European and world institutions. We cannot ignore them in feeding for the chemical strategy and the zero pollution action, especially for the objective of better monitoring, report and preventing and remedy pollution from air, water, soil and consumer products. Contaminated sites should be part of this. I take the opportunity also to highlight that the report from WHO is very, very new and was published last month. So feel free to download then those reports if you are interested in know more. And I'm here with the Impel logo, so let me take 15 seconds to speak about the project that is ongoing, promoting the water and land remediation. And we want to promote sustainable remediation technologies that are not different from dig and dump and pump and treat, that are not sustainable in the long term. So this is a project that is running under Impel, and if you are interested, the next two remediation technologies that will be covered are multi-phase extraction and soil washing. Join us if you have case studies, and I take the opportunity of this stage also to make some advertisement of this Impel project.
Thank you very much indeed.
From my side, thanks a lot for the invitation, and enjoy the European Green Week.
Thank you, Marco. And in fact, our speakers will not be going away when we go to the panel discussion. So if you have questions for them, please do send them in via Slido. I see that you've started to send in questions. The more the merrier, and please vote on the questions that you're most interested that we go to first. And we will be actually also following up on something Marco said in a little poll in a moment. But we I've already heard that the EU chemical strategy calls for a common open data platform on chemicals to facilitate sharing, access and reuse of information on chemicals. And we've already seen a little bit why that's so important. And in fact, the Commission has already set up a system called Ipchem, which will become an integral part of the common open data platform on chemicals. Here to tell us more, I'm now going to give the floor to Stephanie Bock from the Joint Research Centre.
Thank you, Aminda. So yes, as you heard, now we come to the question on how we can best access and reuse monitoring data. I will therefore present to you Ipchem, the information platform for chemical monitoring. As you saw before, we have many chemical monitoring programs ongoing that can be linked to various EU legal frameworks, but also can be done as national initiatives or as research projects. So it requires a big effort and investment to run proper monitoring campaigns, and therefore we need to make the best use and reuse of the data we generate. And thus, one of the overall goals is to apply the fair data principles. That means that we want to make the data findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And Ipchem is therefore committed to provide such a single access point to share, search, and access chemical occurrence data in Europe and beyond. And thus it supports filling the knowledge gap on chemical exposure of humans and the environment. So how does Ipchem contribute? It's a unique source offering chemical occurrence data across different media. We cover human biomonitoring data and monitoring data in environmental media, in products and indoor air, and also food and feed. We currently include data from more than 3,000 substances and cover more than 450 million concentration measurements. The most data-rich areas, as you can see here in this graph, are the environmental monitoring data and the food and feed monitoring, but also the other areas are expected to increase considerably in the near future. So this is only possible thanks to the openness and willingness to share data by our data providers, which are not only the EU institutions and agencies, but also member state authorities and research projects with whom we collaborate as partners in order to further develop and improve Ipchem. Then, apart from the sheer volume of data that we offer, of course, the benefit is that the data integrated into Ipchem are also harmonized and quality checked and comparable to some extent across the different media. With each data set, we always publish metadata. That means we have information on the monitoring purpose of the study, on links to additional resources, and we always include a contact point. So for questions of data interpretation, the user can contact the data provider directly. And of course, our final goal is to share data publicly. Currently, we have about 70% of our data collections publicly available. In some cases, of course, we have to observe, for example, data protection rules and to restrict access. But overall, we try wherever we can to make the data public. And now let's briefly look into how to use Ipchem. So if you're interested in a specific chemical, you can search for that chemical by entering the chemical name or the CAS number, and you can filter for example, by the medium you are interested in, which can be, for example, surface water, and you can also filter by country. And then Ipchem will identify the matching data sets that include such data. And then you can either look at the metadata of these data collections to get to know more about the relevant data sets, or you can directly enter the data and you can explore them online, for example, as you see here on the right-hand side on a map, and you can apply additional filters, or you can prepare the data for download via the basket and then for offline analysis. Another way to search for monitoring data is starting from a specific city or locations, and that allows us to explore patterns of exposure to multiple chemicals. But this is still a pilot version that needs to be further developed. But the question of exposure to multiple chemicals, to chemical mixtures, is of particular concern. Every day we are exposed to multiple chemicals through different sources, such as the food we eat, the air we breathe, and the products we use. And our environment and wildlife is, of course, exposed too. If we only look at single chemicals, we might underestimate risks. And therefore, Ipchem aims at providing data that will help us to combine information on concentrations on chemicals across the various media. We can evaluate, for example, the impact of regulatory interventions like a restriction or a ban of a substance by looking at temporal and spatial trends. And we can monitor compliance, meaning that we want to compare concentrations we find to the legal limits or thresholds of concern, and we can identify where we need interventions. Of course, occurrence data and monitoring data is not the only information we need to assess the risks from chemical pollution. We are well aware that we also need, for example, exposure models or data on toxicity and effects on human health and the environment. However, monitoring data and Ipchem play a crucial role and are one element in the chemical strategy for sustainability and also in the Zero Pollution Action Plan. And we will hear more about that in the panel discussion. So with this, I would like to thank you, and I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie. Very interesting about mixtures. We were talking about that in a session this morning about chemicals. And I was saying, you know, by the time you've got out of bed, had a shower, got dressed and just about to leave the house, you've already been exposed to literally, dozens of chemicals. So yes, this mixtures issue is certainly a big thing. Now, I'd like you to all go to Slido again, please, because I'd like to launch another poll which links to what Marco was talking about. You said that the EU was not doing enough, but we've now heard the EU is doing actually quite a lot on monitoring, and there is progress going on. So I would like to show the poll, please, rather than the questions. And can we launch the poll, which is about how you would like to access environmental data? Is it through a dedicated website or app? Is it through a central website that integrates various data sources, through publications, or you don't access environmental data? I'm going to leave that running in the background, and I'm just going to vote myself as well, because it means I can start seeing your answers. And now I'd like to introduce our new panelists who are going to join us for the discussions. When I say hello, when I say your name, please say hello. hello. So we are joined by Bernhard Berger, who is Deputy Head of the Sustainable Chemicals Unit at DG Environment in the European Commission, our GreenWeek hosts.
Hello, good afternoon again.
Thank you. We have Bruno Dujardin, who is Senior Scientific Officer in the Evidence Management Unit at the European Food Safety Authority, EFSA.
Hello, good afternoon.
We have Professor Christina Ruden, who comes from the Department of Environmental Science at Stockholm University, where she is Professor in Regulatory Toxicology and Ecotoxicology.
Hello.
And we have Professor Robert Barouki, who is Head of Research Unit at the National Institute for Health and Medical Research and Professor of Biochemistry at the University of Paris.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you all for joining us. So I'm going to start with you, Bernhard Berger. You're leading the EU chemical strategy. How is that part of the paradigm shift counting down to a cleaner future? I can't hear you. I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry, I did.
Now we can hear you.
You can hear me, that's very good. Again, good afternoon to everybody. Thanks, Aminda, for giving me the floor, for inviting me also to this discussion, which is very interesting. And allow me to go a little broader, and I will come to your question, I hope, in a little broader context. But first of all, I would like to point out or to explain why we so urgently need monitoring. And that's very simple, because monitoring is basically our eyes. Without monitoring, we do not know where we come from, and we do not know where we are going. This is obviously true for all policy areas, but certainly for the chemicals policy and the link to hazardous chemicals. And here we come to your question, really, it is particularly relevant these days due to the new chemicals strategy for sustainability, which was adopted in October. And this strategy aims at a toxic-free environment, so it's straight in the core of today's discussion. So we need monitoring to see if our policies and the policies we will implement following this strategy, notably to protect human health and the environment, if these policies actually work. And allow me to make a second point, Aminda, which is basically, what do we need to look at and why? And obviously we have a look at the policy objectives of our strategy. This is what we have to focus on. We want, and this is what the strategy says, we want to make the green transition of the chemicals industry and its value chain a reality. We want chemicals to be used more safely and sustainably. Of course, we want to protect human health and the environment from hazardous chemicals. Chemicals that have chronic effects for human health and the environment, which we call substances of concern, should be minimized and substituted as far as possible. So we have to look at these hazardous substances because they have a negative impact on human health and the environment, and especially if you have a continuous exposure. And finally, if you allow me, the classical question that comes up always and that already came up in your first poll, Aminda, what is the Commission doing to ensure we have the right monitoring in place? We have worked on this since a while, and for instance, one thing we have done is setting up the Ipchem platform, which the JRC is running for the Commission, and about which you heard earlier from Stephanie. We have supported from the Commission's perspective what we call the Human Biomonitoring Project. And we would like to extend the monitoring in this context also to environmental monitoring, basically to complement the data we already have from other different reporting streams. But we're not stopping there. We're also working hard to make sense out of the data that we collect, and also to make them accessible and usable to everybody as much as possible. And finally, we are also developing the necessary indicators that will help us use the data and show us the way towards a cleaner future. These were the three main messages, Aminda. Thank you very much. And I will interfere later.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. And I'm going to go straight to Bruno Desjardins from EFSA. EFSA is obviously very busy in monitoring the safety of chemicals in our foods, but also that are used to grow and make our foods, meaning that you have to conduct multiple risk assessments. Can you tell us more about that?
Yes, thank you, Amanda. Well, indeed, we need to do a lot of chemical risk assessment, among other issues, of course. But our focus is in general on the food chain. But so far, we have always been looking at chemicals in isolation, or certain predefined groups of chemicals. And of course, science is evolving, expectations are increasing from the public, and we really need to have this more holistic approach where we look at multiple chemicals. And that's where, for us, these monitoring data play a crucial role, because they will allow us to understand what is the exposure from other sources, and we can better anticipate how a new chemical used in the food chain, for example, may increase that overall risk that consumers are exposed to. And that's also why Ipchem is really an important platform for us. On one hand, we hope to get their information to which we currently don't have access, or even data that we don't know about for the moment. And on the other hand, we have collected a lot of chemical monitoring data in food, and we are happy to share them there in return. And so we really see this Ipchem platform as an exchange platform for all different stakeholders involved. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. It'd be interesting to hear a little bit more, maybe later on, about actually who is using the Ipchem platform and what kind of uses they're using it for. But I'm going to ask that in a moment, because I'd like to, let's say, go to some of the science side with Christina Ruden. You're a scientist and your expertise is in chemical mixtures. We've already touched on them a little bit. We heard from Stephanie earlier on. And your expertise is on how they're used and the volumes that are involved. Is it possible to predict the risk that these chemical mixtures pose?
Yes, thank you, Amanda. Well, I will address that question, but to start from the beginning, I would say that the new chemical strategy aims at developing a system for safe and sustainable use of chemicals in general. And one of the deficiencies of the current approach is that chemicals are now usually assessed one by one, and indeed also one type of use at the time. Assessing single chemicals and single uses means, unfortunately, that total exposures will be underestimated, and there are two reasons for that. Firstly, one chemical can have multiple sources that are risk assessed by different authorities. So, for instance, the European Food Safety Authority deals with the chemicals that appear in food contact materials, while the European Chemicals Agency will review the same chemicals when they are used in consumer articles. So, to assess total emissions and exposures, we need to combine data from all the sources. Secondly, multiple chemicals can come from the same source. Using the same examples, food contact materials and consumer articles contains a mixture of different chemicals that can contribute to our exposures. So to assess total exposures, data from all sources need to be combined. So how does the new chemical strategy aim to improve this system? Well, first of all, to gather, store, and harmonize data across different sources and legislations and to make them easily accessible is really very welcome. However, for many chemicals, important data are still lacking, and in practice, it is indeed often impossible to acquire full scientific knowledge about the exact size of chemical risks. Therefore, we must be able to manage risks with less than complete knowledge. And one example of such a simplified approach is the proposed mixture assessment factor, and that can be applied across chemical legislations and manage mixture risks without access to complete exposure data. And finally, I would like to emphasize the need for full transparency. To allow so-called third-party access to data makes it easier to perform high-quality research studies on exposures. And such studies will in turn help inform society on the effectiveness of policies on chemicals and help achieve a toxic-free environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I see we already have a question on mixtures, so I think we'll be coming back to you a little bit to discuss a little bit more about that. But before we do that, I'd like to hear from Robert Barucchi. We already heard the words human biomonitoring mentioned earlier on, and part of your scientific work is in that very sphere. For those people who don't know about it, can you tell us what it is and why is it significant in monitoring chemicals?
Yes, thank you. Happy to do that. Well, human biomonitoring is a fantastic tool actually to assess exposure of humans. We have heard that chemicals can come from various sources, water, air, food, whatever, but they all converge in humans. So if you assay what's in our body, if you estimate the amount of chemicals in our body, you are integrating all the different sources by doing that. So that's what we do. We do it in blood, we do it in urine. But from there on, it's also the start of another story, because from the blood, the chemicals can go to tissues, to your brains, to your gonads, to the fetus, if it's, we have a pregnant woman. And then, so we can estimate through modeling the amount of chemicals that is exactly in the tissue. And from there, we can follow the chain of events, of toxicological events that lead to an adverse outcome. Let me give you an example. For example, bisphenol A, which is a plasticizer, an endocrine disruptor. Actually, it was an endocrine disruptor before being a plasticizer, contaminates us, and we can assay this in our blood. But we know we can predict how much of it is going into the fetus in a pregnant woman. And we know that bisphenol A has an impact when its exposure occurs during pregnancy. It has an impact on increasing the risk of a number of chronic diseases later in life of the child. So it is extremely important to have this integrated view of the contamination of human. And we do that in Europe. We have a big program called Human Biomonitoring for Europe, HBM4U, that will be followed up by PARC. We do exposure there, but we also associate the exposure to a health impact. So I think it is extremely important that human biomonitoring could be sustained in Europe, that the effort to human biomonitoring should be sustained. We need this information. Ipchem obviously is very important for that, but if you look at the numbers in Ipchem, the numbers of data coming from human are still extremely minor, and we hope that in the future it will become much larger. But for that, Ipchem should be strengthened and get all the tools and the funding that they need. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. Very interesting. And I think really human biomonitoring certainly is going to be an important part of the whole monitoring data, so that we can get a clear picture of what is actually happening to us within ourselves. And since we're talking about monitoring, I'd like to go and monitor the results of our poll. Please, can we see the Slido poll that I asked earlier on? I'd like to see that on the screen. We were asking about how you would like to have access to environmental data, and the overall winner by a large margin is through a central website that integrates various data sources. 74% wanted that. Some people wanted it through a dedicated website or app. That was only 18%, and nobody wanted it through publications. Marco, I'm going to come straight to you on that one, because you were the one asking people. What do you think about that? I mean, do you think that is viable to have a central website that integrates various web sources?
I think so. could be an hub of where different institutions, different DGs put their data on their environmental data. This would be the complete application of Inspire Directive, I think, and could also make the more confident the European citizen in the European authorities in facing environmental problems.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, I'm now going to go to our audience questions for a moment. So the one that has the most votes, it's got 6 votes, and it's about that tricky subject of mixtures again. How do we closely monitor the effect of mixtures? In practice, there are lots of compounds which enhance or lower the environmental health-related risks. So obviously, Christina, maybe you want to come on this, and maybe Stephanie too. Christina?
I mean, when we risk assess chemicals, we really do it in 2 steps. So the first step is to identify hazards or toxicities or intrinsic properties of the molecule that it can cause some kind of harm. And the second step is exposure assessment. And for mixtures, I mean, the major problem is that we know relatively little about what mixtures to actually risk assess. If we have the exact composition, I mean, we know exactly what chemicals are in the mixture and in what concentrations. We can do risk assessment based on data for the individual chemicals. Or if we have a mixture in some kind of container, we can actually test the mixture. But if we look at the real life, very, very complicated, complex and variable exposures to cocktail of large number of different chemicals, we don't really do that kind of risk assessment. So that is not really a part of the regulatory system today. So to risk assess the complexity or the holistic approach to exposures. That is.
I mean, do you think we're going to maybe get to a point where we can do that or will be doing that?
No, I don't think so. We have tens of thousands of industrial chemicals and other types of chemicals on the market, and we are exposed in, as I said, unknown mixtures that also varies in time and in space. So to actually test or do risk assessments in a science-based way for each and every conceivable mixture is in practice impossible. We need some simpler way of approaching mixture risks, as I indicated in my intervention.
Yeah. Stephanie, you were talking about how Ipchem is got a new experimental part about mixtures. Do you think this is going to become more and more part of the work and the data and the monitoring that we're doing?
Yeah, I guess it's important that we try to bring data together across different media, and that helps us with the so-called aggregate exposure to cover different sources and to look into more chemicals that appear simultaneously. And for that we have this pilot version which will be developed further. And because you also asked about who is using Ipchem and so on. So the latest requests we got were, for example, some of them were related to deriving what Christina explained before, this mixture assessment factor that can be applied as an additional safety factor in single substance risk assessment to cover for these unintentional mixtures that are not well defined. And we got requests, for example, to have all the environmental data that we have in Ipchem to support exploring how big such a factor could be. And in-house, we also tried to explore the human biomonitoring data that we get, if we could use those for the environmental, for the human health side.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to, Caroline, I'd like to come to you because you can talk about mixtures and the monitoring of those mixtures. Very tricky subject, really.
Yeah, I think this is there are methods called biological effects methods to try and measure the toxicity of water, say, and so particularly for certain classes of groups of substances. And I think it's actually quite a live debate at the moment in Europe about how. Okay, so we've got some methods. Do we know what substances they address? Because what you want eventually to do is stop those substances getting out. But it's also then how do you set thresholds? What's the right threshold? And this is actually quite a live debate at the moment with the Water Framework Directive and the chemical standards that we can be set at the monitoring level. So this is where we're getting the feedback from the monitoring. We're finding there's a problem there. Use that feedback to then go back and inform the policy.
Thank you. And Robert?
Yeah, just a word to say that you're using some human biomonitoring and epidemiological studies, what's in our blood, you can associate some mixtures of compound with some toxic effect, and then you can focus on those mixtures because they are more worrisome than others. Also, that we know now, based on simply mechanistic studies, that many chemicals have some similar mode of action, and those that have similar mode of action, there is a really good reason to believe that we should add the doses and with some correction, and then we can have an idea about the cumulative effects.
Thank you. I'm going to go to more questions from the public now. We've actually got a couple in from Andrew Turley from Chemical Watch. I'll go to the one which has the most votes first. Should laws and policy require more information from industry? For example, PFAS class is diverse and generally regulators don't know what compounds to look for. And in fact, PFAS will be discussed in a session later on this afternoon. But the idea of, should we be saying to industry, you must provide us with the information? Maybe Bruno, sorry, Bernhard, can I come to you?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm happy to say a few words on this. Thank you very much also for the question. Well, first of all, I think we have to acknowledge that we are actually asking industry a lot of information on the chemicals. We are the REACH regulation, which is basically the R of REACH stands for registration. That means the industry needs to provide, when they register their chemical, needs to provide to the Commission, and this is then carried out by ECHA, by our chemicals agency in Helsinki, a lot of information on the properties, including the toxic and the ecotoxic properties of the different chemicals. So I think it's fair to say that ECHA has really a unique, worldwide, huge information on the various chemicals that are registered, meaning that are used in the European Union. Having said this, I know that it's always things to improve. And here, indeed, there are a few issues which we pointed out also in the chemical strategy where we need to look at and ask, indeed, more information. One classical example that has been discussed since a while are the polymers. For the polymers, for the moment, we're not asking for registration. So this is something, and this you can also find in our chemical strategy, this is something we need to address, and we would like to address it, and we are working on this. What and how can we ask industry to provide information? But there's also more, for instance, on all substances which are only used at very small volumes or smaller volumes where we require less information. We have to look very carefully if the information there is enough and if we do not need to ask for more. Maybe to explain this very briefly, we have different what we call tonnage bands. For a tonnage band, let's say between 1 and 10 tons, we ask less information to industry than for a higher tonnage band. So we need to see if this is still in line and if we need more information from industry. So to cut a long story short, yes, I think we do this already quite intensively, but there's a lot of actions or activities described in the strategy, what we want to do more or what we should do more. One last word on the on PFAS, if you allow. PFAS falls a little between the cracks of this system because it is not really, or in many cases, not in all cases, in many cases, it's really kind of a side product that is generated unwantedly. So in that case, this is not only for PFAS, but for all similar substances, this falls a little bit between the cracks, but should then be covered up by the toxicology and by the ecotoxicology information we're getting. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christina?
Yes, I agree totally that REACH delivers some data, but a major problem that was pointed out here are the low volume chemicals. So it's indeed, I mean, almost rudimentary data required for low volume chemicals, and below 1 ton per producer and per year, there is no data requirement. So those chemicals are not even covered by the REACH. And there is currently no systematic test requirements that are used to identify endocrine disrupting chemicals. So, and that is a huge problem if we look at health effects and also environmental species. And if we are going to do something more science-based about mixtures, we also need much more data on volumes, different uses and emissions from different sources that could be required by industry. And last but not least, again, I would like to stress the need for transparency, because a lot of the data that is registered now within the REACH registrations, they are company secrets, so they can't be used to build better exposure models or to do research in this area. Thank you.
Interesting. I mean, in fact, on the opening session of GreenWeek, we heard the commissioners say that it was important that zero pollution became business as usual. But it seems like we're really quite far away from there if they're not even telling us the chemicals that could be dangerous. Marco, you know a bit about PFAS. Now, obviously, this is not a session about PFAS, so I don't want to really get into that. There's a dedicated one later on this afternoon. But Marco, you had some things to add about regulation and reporting.
Yes, it's a very complex issue, the one of PFAS, because it's a class of compounds, and I'm fresh of preparing a 12 hours training courses for my colleagues. So they are PFAS is a class of 5,000 compounds: polymeric, non-polymeric, long versus short chain, linear versus non-linear, and anions versus cations versus zwitterionic compounds. They are sulfonic, carboxylic, or alcoholic compounds. So it's a class of compounds. The question from Andrew is very, very interesting. How to monitor those chemicals? I think that the solution could be what comes also from Europe. The review of the Drinking Water Directive is taking into account those compounds. According to the information I have, is under discussion to put 12 different PFAS or 20 different PFAS inside the monitoring for the Drinking Water Directive. Let's see what happens. Having told this is not the solution at all, because you know, the chemical industry, when you regulate one chemical, you know, when you have a class of compounds, you may add simply a CF3 to the molecule, and you have another name. So it's not anymore monitored. So it's not. I don't think it is the full solution, the Drinking Water Directive, but will be an important first step. The solution could be monitoring the class of PFAS as such.
Bernhard, did you want to come back in?
Yes, if you don't mind, and if this is going more in the area of PFAS, going away a little from the monitoring, from the policy perspective, just allow me to add that in fact the Commission plans to act on PFAS. And again, we have this in the chemical strategy that we want the restrictions on PFAS, in particular in firefighting foams, but also in all other uses. So from the regulatory perspective, I think we are quite active, and this work is currently underway, in particular in our agency in Helsinki. Thank you.
Thank you. And I'm going to, there's obviously Andrew is very active on our questions, but one of the questions he asked is about the human biomonitoring. And it says, and I'd like to ask you, Robert, about that. Are you concerned human biomonitoring data could become a prerequisite for regulation, slowing down needed protective action because we currently have little data? I don't know quite what you think of that question.
I think I don't think that human biomonitoring alone should be, you know, the basis of new action. It has to be combined with the other information on other monitoring and modeling. I think that it's part of a bigger picture. And in general, I don't think one should wait too much to take some action, even if I think that human biomonitoring could be extremely helpful and should be developed and become actually more or less mandatory at one point or another for some chemicals at least. I think this is important and this should go this way. However, in the meantime, as long as we should not stop from taking some action because it's not there yet. So let's try to take the most reasonable action now and then develop and a sustainable human biomonitoring to take maybe more adequate action later on.
Thank you very much. Bruno, I wanted to ask you, there's another question that's come in, which I thought was interesting, particularly in the area of food. It says, are lab studies suited to assess risk in an environmental system? You know, we've also heard about the way, you know, you can test in a lab and then, you know, in the real world, it's a whole different story. What do you think? Are lab studies suited?
Well, I think first of all, what we need to ensure, I mean, and this pertains to any kind of studies but also monitoring data, is we need to make sure that there is a certain level of independence to it. And this is an issue, for example, at the European Food Safety Authority, which is really crucial. If you get data from industry, there is always the question, how much are these data biased? And so this is one point, I think, which is important to mention. But then for lab studies, I think we do use a lot of lab studies. I mean, if you have a substance which has never been on the market and you need to decide on authorization of that substance, you need lab studies. And that's why normally we would develop some proper guidance documents that really allow us to design studies in such a way that they are considered to be sufficiently conservative and protective, and that they would cover cases in reality. But of course, we are never 100% sure. And that's where it's really important that we loop it back to monitoring data afterwards. Monitoring data will always be needed also from that perspective, I think, to kind of validate laboratory studies which have been performed.
Yes, of course. Yes. Okay, thank you. And I'm going to come to our last question because in a while we're going to have to start wrapping up. Anonymous sends in a question saying, wouldn't it be appropriate that the industry needs to provide the analysis method to assess their product in the environment? That's interesting, you know, so they don't necessarily need to tell us what the chemicals are, but how we can assess them. I don't know, maybe our scientists want to come in on that. Christina?
Yeah, yes. I think that is very important. We need the methods, but we also need standards so that we have something to compare to when we take monitoring samples. And I think there has been some recent cases where that has highlighted the need for that. So I think that is a very good idea to make industry provide such a standard and also the methods. I strongly agree.
Would anyone else like to jump in on that one?
Can I just maybe add one thing on that? This is Bruno speaking. No, actually, I just wanted to highlight that this principle already exists, for example, in the area of pesticides. In principle, you cannot obtain authorization for pesticide if the company has not demonstrated that there is a suitable analytical method available for monitoring pesticides afterwards. And we have actually the same issue on standards. So for the chemical standards, in principle, there is also a kind of requirement, but that's quite complicated because the companies themselves cannot always produce them. So it's this is a more tricky issue, but we also try to put some requirements there also on the standards.
But it's interesting, you know, that we've done it for pesticides, but we haven't done it for other things. For example, you know, Marco, you were talking earlier on about there isn't even a common definition of what a contaminated site is. You know, these seem to be simple things that, you know, we've already done in one area. Why aren't we doing in another? I mean, it seems there are a few gaps in what we need to do. I don't know, maybe if Bernhard, you want to come back on that?
No, you know that the problem is that for contaminated sites, we have a lack of an European directive. We have the Water Framework Directive, the Wastewater Framework Directive, Waste Framework Directive, and we don't have a directive for contaminated sites. So member states, by themselves, prepare their own legislation, and so contaminated sites in some cases is defined after risk assessment, in other cases just with the threshold value. So it is complex, very complex, the situation. Coming back to the question from to assess the product in the environment, I would say that I agree my colleagues, and I think that this assessment should be done, at least to see if that product is biodegradable or not. We know that there are some methods already available from OECD for the already biodegradability, or there are plenty of other methods to test. I think the good idea for any product that is in the market to test also on the environment, not only on the human, the effect on human.
Okay, thank you, Bernhard. Literally a couple of sentences because we're now really coming to the end of the session.
No, only one sentence. I think also for the non-pesticide chemicals, we have standards that the chemical industry needs to respect when they submit the data.
Okay, thank you. Bruno, would you like to give us your final takeaway on monitoring?
No, well, I think a lot has been said, and I think it's really interesting to see that there is the interest to generate those data, and I think for us this is really the crucial point also as scientists, and also I'm a data scientist, so in particular in the future I think we could start launching artificial intelligence on all those data, and that would be I think really exciting. So I think anyway for scientists we have exciting times ahead. Thank you.
Okay, Christina, do you agree? Quick question, Chris, wrap up.
Yeah, I think we have exciting times. I would like to stress the need that we really consider that the system is proactive, so we can't rely on data on chemicals that have already been emitted, exposing the environment and humans and potentially harming them. So a system should be able to identify unacceptable hazards before emissions occur. And the monitoring should be a complement to that to evaluate our efforts. Thank you.
And Robert, human biomonitoring, the way forward?
Well, I mean, we have new technologies that are now coming up, and we can now associate much better exposure with health effect. But I would like to stress one thing. I think we have to focus also on emerging chemicals, and we did not really discuss that there, but I mean, there are methodologies now that support the a determination of emerging chemicals in human and in the environment, of course, and that's, I think, very crucial.
Very interesting. Yes, we need a whole other session on that. Caroline, last takeaway phrase?
I think it's super exciting, the new possibilities with data and presentation, and that going forward, it gives us a whole world of opportunity now to do something.
Okay, and last word to Stephanie.
Thanks. So I think, yeah, what was said already, we should link monitoring data to other data to explore more how, for example, chemicals contribute to environmental effects and development of disease in humans and so on, so we can better match with other data sets. And I think regarding the monitoring data, we are on the right track, and we need to better reuse the data and try to share data in a better way. That's already happening, and I think we can further enhance that in the near future.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. Well, thanks to all our speakers, panelists, a very interesting discussion. On behalf of the organisers, thank you all for your contributions. There's now going to be a 15-minute break, and then there are more sessions coming up, including one on PFAS. So if you want to tune in, that comes up at 3:30. And with that, the only thing left for me to do is to thank you for watching and for participating in the polls and for sending in your questions and voting. And with that, I close this session.